where the story stops. 2.5 miles beneath the North Atlantic, in permanent darkness, the most famous ship in the world is slowly being eaten alive. Almost everyone knows how the Titanic sank. Almost no one knows what has become of her since. And what is down there now is stranger than the night she went under. So before we go down to her, let yourself settle in. Lower the lights if you can, and let your eyes grow heavy. From here on, there is nothing to do but breathe slowly and listen. You have seen the films and the photographs. You know about the iceberg and the lifeboats and the band that kept playing. That story has been told so many times that it can feel finished. But the night she sank was only the first chapter. The longer story is what happened to her afterward, far below, where almost no one ever looks. To reach it, we are going to follow her all the way down. We begin on a flat and frozen sea, on a clear April night. We move through the collision and the slow flooding and the breaking apart. We fall through more than 3,000 meters of black water to the place where she lies now. And then we see what the deep has been doing to her ever since. The descent only goes one way, down, and then further down, and never back to the surface. That is how this whole story moves. It begins in warmth and electric light. It ends in cold and silence and the weight of the sea. We are going to take it slowly, one step at a time, the way the ship herself took it. Along the way, there are things that very few people know. The ship was warned about the ice again and again, and held her speed anyway. The men watching for danger had no binoculars. The lifeboats she carried were never going to be enough, and she still met every rule of her day. The sea that night was so still that it hid the very thing that could destroy her. And there is the strangest part of all. When she was finally found on the seafloor, it happened almost by accident. The man who found her was on a secret mission for the Navy, a mission that had nothing to do with the Titanic at all. We will get there, in time, at the bottom of the descent. So how does the largest ship in the world end up lost for more than 70 years? What is actually down there now, in the cold and the dark, all this time later? And what happened to the people who went down with her and never came back up? If you enjoy these kinds of topics, a like really does help this channel grow. Consider subscribing if you want more. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what mystery of the deep you would most like us to explore next. It might become the topic of a future video. With that said, let's get back to the topic. There is one more thing to know before we begin. The deep sea is the largest hidden place on Earth, and we have mapped less of it than we have mapped the surface of the moon. Most of what lies down there has never been seen by human eyes. It is closer to another planet than to the world we know. The Titanic did not simply sink. She crossed out of our world and into that one. Keep that in mind as we follow her down. We are not only watching a ship go under, we are watching her pass into a place we still barely understand, where she has now spent far longer than she ever sailed on the surface. From here, everything moves downward. Hold on to that picture of the calm sea and the warm lights, because it is the last gentle thing in this story before the cold takes over. The descent begins now. Begin on the surface, on the night it all started, the 14th of April, 1912. A stretch of open ocean far out in the North Atlantic, dark and flat and impossibly still. The ship is out there in that stillness, moving west through the cold. The lights of her, are the only warm thing for miles, and somewhere ahead of her in the dark, the ice is already waiting, giving nothing away. On the night of April the 14th, 1912, the North Atlantic was doing something unusual. It was completely still. The water lay flat in every direction. It was flat and black and cold. It held the reflection of the stars so cleanly that it was hard to tell where the ocean ended and the sky began. There was no moon at all that night. Sailors who had crossed that water dozens of times said afterward that they had never seen it quite like this. Picture that surface for a moment. No waves, no swell, no wind to put a single ripple on it. Just a vast black mirror stretching out past the edge of sight, with the stars laid across it like a second sky. It was beautiful. It was also, though no one understood this yet, the most dangerous shape the sea could possibly have taken. There is a reason the water was so flat. A wide ridge of high pressure had settled over the whole region, and high pressure brings calm and clear and very cold air. There was no wind to raise a swell. There was no cloud to hold any warmth near the surface. So the heat of the day simply rose away into space, and the air grew colder by the hour, and the sea lay down as smooth as poured glass. A ship was moving through that stillness. She was 4 days out of Southampton and heading west toward New York. The Titanic. She was the largest ship ever built. She was so large that the people describing her kept reaching for comparisons that still fell short. Her funnel stood taller than most buildings of the day. Her hull was longer than several city blocks, set end to end. She carried over 2,000 people, passengers and crew. Most of them were asleep or drifting toward sleep, somewhere inside all that steel and warmth and electric light. Inside, there was music and laughter and the soft hum of the engines through the floor. There were warm beds and lit corridors and the smell of polished wood. Only a thin wall of steel stood between all of that comfort and the freezing water outside. That water was only just above freezing. It was cold in a way that had everything to do with where it had come from. Each spring, a current runs down from the Labrador Sea, carrying cold water south along the coast of North America. That year it had pushed further than usual, and it had brought something with it. Ice. Dozens of ships had already met that ice and sent warnings by wireless through the day. The Titanic had received those warnings. Her captain had read them. Her officers had marked the positions on the chart room board, where they sat through the evening, in plain sight of anyone who cared to look. And still the ship kept moving. She held close to full speed, near 40 kilometers an hour, through the flat black water. The night was clear and the sea was calm. The thinking on the bridge was simple. In conditions like these, the lookouts high in the crow's nest would see any ice in good time and steer around it. That thinking was about to meet something it had not accounted for. Something quiet and specific about this particular night. The stillness, the clear air, the complete absence of moonlight. Something that had been sitting out there all evening, without anyone quite naming it. Inside the ship, the evening had been a quiet pleasure. Dinners had ended. In the lounges, people sat with coffee and conversation. In the smoking rooms, men played cards under warm electric lamps. Slowly, the great ship settled toward sleep, corridor by corridor, light by light. It was, by every account, one of the most comfortable places a person could be on the whole of the ocean. None of them could feel how thin the line was between that warmth and the cold just beyond the steel. That thin wall was about to be tested in the dark, and it would not hold for long. The ship moved west. The cold sat on the water, and somewhere ahead in the dark, the ice was already there, giving nothing away. There is a reason the Titanic felt safe that night. Several reasons, in fact, and all of them were real. She had been built with watertight compartments. Below the waterline, her hull was divided into 16 sealed sections. Think of an ice cube tray, with walls between each cube keeping the water in one place from running into the next. That was the idea. If the sea broke into one section, the heavy doors between sections could be shut, and the flooding held in place. The captain could close those doors from the bridge with the flick of a single switch. The engineers had worked out that she could still float with any 4 of those compartments flooded at once. 4 was the number they had built toward. It was a serious piece of engineering. She also had a double bottom, 2 layers of steel along the base of the hull, so that a grounding on rocks would tear the outer layer and leave the inner one whole. All of this had been described in enough detail, in enough newspapers, that it settled into the public mind as a plain fact. The Titanic could take damage. She would survive it. The word unsinkable appeared in print more than once before she sailed. The company never rushed to correct it. The underlying thinking was sound. The word was an overstatement, but it was not an invention. It came from something real. That confidence shaped choices that seemed entirely reasonable at the time. Consider the lifeboats. The ship carried 20 of them. Together they could hold around 1,200 people. There were more than 2,000 people aboard. To us, that gap looks like obvious madness. At the time, it broke no rules at all. The rules came from a law written in 1894, and the world had changed underneath it. That law set the number of lifeboats by the weight of the ship, not by the number of people aboard. And its table simply stopped at vessels of 10,000 tons and over, which were the largest ships anyone had imagined when it was written. Such ships needed 16 boats. The Titanic weighed more than 40,000 tons, 4 times that limit. She carried 20 boats. She did not just meet the law. She carried more than the law required. The deeper reason the gap felt acceptable was the belief itself. The lifeboats were never meant to empty the ship all at once. They were meant to ferry people across to another vessel if something went wrong. The ship herself would stay afloat long enough for help to arrive. The lifeboats were a detail. The ship was the plan. Out on the water that night, the cold was pressing against the steel of her hull, and the steel was behaving in ways nobody had quite studied. Cold makes some kinds of steel harder and more brittle than they are in a warm shipyard. A material that would bend on a summer afternoon can crack on a freezing night. These were details that sat within what the engineers considered safe margins. The ship was simply not expected to strike anything hard enough to matter. What the unsinkable belief had done, quietly, was shrink the distance between the worst case they had planned for and the point where the whole system would fail. The ship could absorb a great deal, but every system has a threshold, and this one had been set with a single kind of accident in mind. There is a quiet lesson in all of this. Disasters are rarely the work of one foolish choice. They are usually built out of sensible choices, made by careful people, each one reasonable on its own. The lifeboats met the law. The design was sound. The captain was skilled. Every piece was acceptable. The danger lived in the spaces between the pieces, where no single person was looking. That is the shape of what was coming. The ice ahead was a different kind of accident entirely. It would not strike one compartment, it would open many. The belief was warm and solid and shared by almost everyone aboard. The water outside did not share it, and the water was about to be proven right. Segment 4/21, subtopic, Warnings from the ice. By the morning of April the 14th, the warnings had already begun to arrive. To understand why there was so much ice, you have to look north. That winter had been mild in the far north, and a mild winter sends more icebergs south than usual. The bergs break away from the glaciers of Greenland and drift out into the Atlantic, where the cold Labrador current carries them down. That spring the current carried them unusually far south, right across the shipping lanes that ships like the Titanic used. The sea ahead was not just cold, it was crowded with ice. The first warning came from a ship called the Coronia. She reported bergs and field ice sitting directly across the route the Titanic was following. The message was received, read by the captain, and pinned to the chart room board. More came through the afternoon. The Nordam reported ice. The Baltic reported a large quantity of field ice and icebergs. The America reported 2 large bergs. Each message added detail to a picture that was becoming very clear to anyone who studied it. Imagine those messages as marks on a map. One here, one there, then another, slowly drawing a line across the ocean. And the line they drew lay straight across the path of the ship. Anyone laying the warnings side by side would have seen it. A field of ice dead ahead, growing more certain with every hour. By early evening, a small cargo ship, called the Californian, sent a warning of her own. The ice around her was so dense that she had stopped, completely, and was waiting for daylight before going any further. Her message came through while the Titanic's wireless operators were buried in passenger traffic, relaying private messages to a station on the coast of Newfoundland. The Californian's warning was received in the wireless room. It does not appear to have reached the bridge. 6 warnings reached the ship that day. At least one of them, sent in the early evening by a vessel called the Mesaba, described heavy pack ice at positions that put it directly in the Titanic's path. That message also stayed in the wireless room. It never made the short journey to the men steering the ship. The captain was an experienced man. His name was Edward Smith, and he was the most senior captain the company had. He had crossed the North Atlantic many times and had sailed through ice before without harm. The night was strikingly clear. In clear weather, the standard thinking held that a sharp lookout would spot ice far enough ahead to go around it. The ship was fast, but she could also be steered, and the assumption was that speed and visibility together would be enough. So the warnings sat where they had landed. Some rested on the board, some rested in the wireless room, and the ship kept moving through a night so calm and so clear that it genuinely felt like nothing could go wrong. That feeling was the problem. The danger was not that the warnings had been missed. The danger was that they had been received and read and folded into a sense of safety so complete that the marks on the board stopped feeling like a threat. The ice had announced itself all day long. The trouble was that no one was truly afraid of it. There is a sad detail And who stood at the top of all this? The captain, Edward Smith, was the most trusted master in the fleet. Many accounts say this crossing was meant to be his last before he retired. A long and spotless career was supposed to end with the finest ship in the world arriving safely in New York. Instead, it would end here, on a flat, black sea, with the warnings pinned to a board behind him. He did not yet know that, of course. To everyone on the bridge, it was still a clear and ordinary night, near the end of a long career at sea. The cold water carried the ice south. The ship carried her confidence west, and the two were closing on each other in the dark, while the chart room board kept its quiet record, giving nothing away. The two wireless operators aboard the Titanic did not work for the ship at all. They worked for the Marconi Company. Their names were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. Their main job, in commercial terms, was to handle passenger messages. Wireless at sea was still young in 1912. It worked by sending sparks of radio across the water in bursts of dots and dashes, the code that operators tapped out by hand and read back by ear. A strong set like the Titanic's could reach hundreds of kilometers on a good night, far enough to pass messages from the middle of the ocean to a station on land. To passengers, it felt like magic. A message tapped out at sea could reach New York the same evening. Wealthy travelers loved it. They sent greetings across the ocean. They confirmed plans. They conducted business from the middle of the sea. Each message cost money, and the operators worked through them steadily, keeping a queue and keeping the traffic moving. It was ordinary work on an ordinary evening. The click of the key and the hum of the spark, hour after hour. Earlier that day, the equipment had broken down for several hours. For two men who took pride in their work, a dead set was a small disaster. They had fixed it themselves rather than wait, and when it came back to life, the backlog of unsent messages was large. Phillips had been working hard through the evening to clear it. By the time the Californian's operator tried to break in with his ice warning, Phillips was deep in a stream of messages going out to the relay station at Cape Race in Newfoundland. The Californian was close. Her signal came through so loudly that it overwhelmed the sound in Phillips' headphones. Picture trying to write down one quiet voice while a second voice shouts directly in your ear. He sent back a short reply. "Keep out. I am busy. I am working Cape Race." It was not the reply of a man brushing off a safety warning out of laziness. It was the reply of someone whose work had just been cut across, mid-sentence, by a louder signal. Phillips had no way of knowing that this particular message was the most detailed and best positioned ice report of the entire day. There was no rule at the time that put navigation warnings ahead of paid traffic. Nobody had written that rule yet, because nobody had yet needed to. The Californian's operator switched off his set, and went to bed around 11:15 that evening. His ship was sitting stopped in the ice field, less than 20 kilometers from where the Titanic was heading. Her wireless was now silent. Nobody aboard her was listening. Back on the Titanic, the passenger messages kept moving. Phillips kept working. The night outside stayed cold and clear. The ship kept her speed. The warnings on the board stayed on the board, and everything continued to feel, from inside the warmth of that little room, entirely under control. It is worth remembering how young these two men were, and how hard they worked. They were not safety officers. They were message clerks, paid to move private words across the sea. And yet, once the ship was struck, they would stay at their key for hours. They kept sending the calls for help long after they could have left for the boats. The same devotion to the work that crowded out the ice warning would, in the end, keep the distress call alive. There is a strange symmetry in it. The work that kept the danger out of the room would also become the thing that called the whole world toward it. The same hands, the same key, the same quiet focus, turned now toward saving lives instead of sending greetings. This is the quiet shape of the whole night. There was no single careless act. There was a series of small and reasonable decisions, each one sensible on its own, lining up in the dark. The cold water did not need anyone to be careless. It only needed the warning to stop one room short of the bridge, giving nothing away. A ship the size of the Titanic did not stop quickly. Bringing her from cruising speed to a full stop took several kilometers of open water. Reversing her engines, the emergency option, sent a heavy shudder through the whole hull and actually reduced her ability to steer. The propellers that normally drove water past the rudder were suddenly pushing it the other way. She was powerful and she was huge. Those two things together made her hard to control in a hurry. It helps to feel the scale of it. Imagine trying to swerve a fully loaded freight train around something that appears in the headlights. The mass simply wants to keep going. The Titanic was that kind of object. Her weight carried its own momentum, and momentum is patient. It does not care what the rudder is doing for several long seconds after the order is given. There was another quiet weakness too. Her rudder, by the standards of her enormous size, was not especially large, and a ship turns no faster than her rudder can push her. The choice to hold speed that night was not reckless by the standards of the time. North Atlantic captains sailed through ice every spring. The accepted logic was clear. In good weather, a large ship with sharp lookouts could see ice far enough off to go around it. Slowing down only meant spending more time among the ice, which carried its own risk. Speed carried you through. The open water on the far side of the ice field was the goal. There was also a gentler pressure behind the speed. This was the ship's first crossing, and the company wanted a strong and confident passage. Nobody had ordered a dangerous run, but a great new ship making good time was the quiet expectation. And expectations like that settle into 100 small choices, without anyone deciding them out loud. This logic had worked before. It had worked many times. The crossings that became disasters were the ones in fog or rain or poor visibility. They were the nights when the assumption that you could see what was coming no longer held. On a clear night with bright stars and calm water, the calculation seemed sound. What the captain and his officers did not yet understand was that the very clearness of the night was working against them. The stars were brilliant, but there was no moon. And moonlight is what throws a shadow across the face of an iceberg and gives it away from a distance. Without it, a berg sitting in dark water becomes very hard to see until you are nearly upon it. There was a second problem hiding inside the R. First, the water that night was so flat and so still that there were no waves breaking at the base of anything floating in it. There was no white water, no foam, no ring of disturbance to mark where the ice sat. So speed, under these exact conditions, was not safety. Speed was the thing that would remove any chance of response once the ice was finally seen. The faster she moved, the less those last few seconds would be worth. There was even a small hidden fire aboard. Down in one of the coal bunkers, a slow smolder had been burning in the stored coal, the kind of thing that could happen on ships of that age. The crew managed it the usual way, by shoveling that coal into the furnaces faster than the rest. Whether it weakened anything is still debated, and we should not overstate it. But it is one more reminder that the ship was a vast and complicated machine, with many small problems being quietly managed at once. None of these things alone would have sunk her. That is the lesson of the whole night. It took many small things, each one survivable on its own, all arriving together in the same dark hour. The hour had nearly come, and the sea was ready. But nobody had joined those pieces yet. The ship moved on. The engines pushed. The cold water parted at the bow and closed again behind her. And from the bridge the night kept looking like a perfect crossing. It gave nothing away. Frederick Fleet had been up in the crow's nest since 10 o'clock. The crow's nest sat about 70 feet above the waterline, partway up the forward mast. On a clear night, the view forward from there was wide. Even in still air, the cold at that height was sharp, and the ship's own movement made a steady, freezing wind across the little platform. Fleet had been cold for 2 hours. He was doing what lookouts do. He swept the horizon in slow, steady arcs, watching for anything that broke the line where the dark water met the dark sky. He was experienced. He knew what he was looking for, and at some point during the watch, he said to the other lookout, a man named Reginald Lee, that he wished they had a pair of binoculars. There had been binoculars at the start of the voyage. They had been kept in the crow's nest during the short run from Belfast to Southampton. Then there was a late change of officers before the Atlantic crossing. The man who knew where they were left the ship, and the glasses were never seen again. They may have simply been locked away in a cabin with no one able to say where the key had gone. Fleet had raised the matter before the crossing began. He had been told that nothing could be done about it, so he watched the dark with nothing but his own 2 eyes. Whether binoculars would have changed anything that night is a question with no certain answer. In darkness, binoculars do gather more light, which helps, but they also narrow the field of view, which means a lookout using them can miss something at the edges while he studies one point ahead. Some experienced lookouts preferred bare eyes at night, because side vision is better at catching movement and shape in low light. Binoculars are for studying a thing you have already seen, not for finding it in the first place. What can be said for certain is this: Fleet was relying on his own unaided eyes. He had to find a dark object against dark water, under a sky with no moon and no waves. He was alert. He was scanning correctly. He was doing everything right. The iceberg gave him almost nothing to work with. Not long before, it had rolled over in the water, the way bergs sometimes do when they melt unevenly and lose their balance. The face now turned toward the oncoming ship was dark ice. Fresh, wet, recently rolled ice does not catch starlight the way old white ice does. It sits low in the water and seems to swallow what little light there is. So the one piece of luck that might have saved her was already gone. The berg in her path was not a bright white tower standing out against the night. It was a dark shape, in dark water, almost the same color as the sky behind it. It was, in the most literal sense, hiding in plain sight. Fleet would live for many years after that night, and he would be asked about it again and again. The missing binoculars followed him through all of it. He always believed that with them, he might have seen the ice a little sooner. Others were not so sure. The two men up there were near the end of a longed, freezing watch. There is a small mercy in the timing. The ice was seen while experienced eyes were still on it. Fleet did his job. He saw the thing that was almost impossible to see, and he rang the bell and made the call. The failure was not his. It was spread across the whole long chain of the night, from a missing pair of glasses to a sea too smooth to help him. That is worth holding on to, because it is true of almost everyone who failed that night. Few of them were careless. Most were doing their jobs as well as they knew how. The disaster was built not from one person's mistake, but from 100 ordinary limits meeting one impossible night. Fleet kept scanning. The wind pulled at him at the top of his mast. The ship kept moving below, and somewhere ahead in the dark, the iceberg waited, low and patient and almost invisible, giving nothing away. There is something the ocean usually does that nobody thinks about, because it is so constant that it becomes invisible. Water breaks against solid things. Even in calm conditions, there is usually some swell. The long, slow breathing of the sea driven by far-off weather. When that swell reaches something solid, it lifts against it and falls back, and it makes white water at the base. Even at night, that white water shows up before the object itself does. A lookout watching the dark does not really need to see the iceberg. He needs to see the foam at its foot, a small pale disturbance in an otherwise black sea. Usually, that is enough. On the night of April the 14th, there was no swell. Officers who lived through it struggled afterward to find words for how strange it was. Like a pond, several of them said. Like a mirror, like a lake on a still summer evening. It was the flattest water any of them had seen on the North Atlantic in years. Some of them had spent their whole lives at sea and could not remember another night like it. That should make you pause, because these were not nervous men. They were professionals, and the calm itself unsettled them. It was flat because every condition that could make it flat had lined up at once. Cold air, cold water, no wind, a wide ridge of high pressure sitting over the whole region. Together, they had stripped the surface of everything that normally moved across it. Now follow what that did. Without swell, there were no waves. Without waves, there was no white water at the base of the iceberg. And so there was nothing to see before the iceberg itself. And the iceberg itself was dark. The sea had quietly switched off its own oldest warning sign. This is the cruel center of the whole night. The same stillness that made the crossing feel so calm and so safe was the exact stillness that blinded them to the danger. The flat black water was not a sign of safety. It was the thing hiding the threat. The beauty and the danger were the same thing, wearing one face. There may have been one more trick of the air that night. Where very cold water meets slightly less cold air, the light can bend in unusual ways near the horizon, smearing the line between sea and sky into a faint, false haze. Some who studied the disaster later believe such a haze sat on the horizon that night, blurring the edge of things at exactly the distance a lookout would most need a clear view. If so, it was one more quiet layer over the ice. The officers had noticed how unusual the night was. Several of them remarked on it to one another. The remarkable calm, the perfect clarity, the stars laid out across the water. They noticed it the way you notice a lovely evening. The link between that stillness and the loss of an early warning for ice was a link that nobody made. It was not yet part of how anyone thought about danger at sea. It would be after this night, but not yet. It is worth saying plainly how rare this was. A sailor could cross the Atlantic for a lifetime and never meet a night so perfectly still on water so dangerously full of ice. The two conditions almost never arrived together. On this night they did, in the same place, at the same hour. It was not bad luck in the ordinary sense. It was a set of small and harmless things, lining up into something that was not harmless at all. And that is the quiet sadness of it. There was no villain. There was no single failure. There was only a calm and beautiful night that happened, by pure chance, to switch off every warning the sea normally gives. The crew were not blind. The sea had simply gone silent and taken its warnings with it. Fleet would have to find the ice with nothing but his eyes. Fleet kept scanning from the crow's nest. The flat sea sat silent in every direction, and the iceberg came on, dark and low and unmarked. The water was hiding it perfectly, giving nothing away. Fleet saw it first as a shape, a patch of darkness against the darkness. It looked slightly wrong and slightly solid, slowly taking form where there should have been only empty sea. He reached for the bell rope above him and rang it 3 times. He lifted the telephone to the bridge. The words he spoke are the ones everyone remembers. Iceberg right ahead. The officer on watch was a man named Murdoch. He heard the words and was already moving. He called for the ship to turn hard, and for the engines to be stopped and then reversed. The helmsman spun the wheel. Slowly, the great ship began to answer. About 37 seconds passed between the moment Fleet saw the iceberg and the moment the ship struck it. At the speed she was moving, those 37 seconds covered roughly 400 meters. That can sound like room to spare. 400 meters is more than 4 city blocks, and a ship that can steer ought to clear something that far off. But the Titanic was over 260 meters long. She weighed more than 50,000 tons. The physics of turning an object that size at that speed did not fold neatly into 400 meters of warning. There is a hard irony buried in those seconds. If Murdoch had done nothing and simply driven the bow straight into the berg, the ship might well have survived. A head-on blow would have crushed the bow and flooded 1 or 2 compartments, and she was built to float through exactly that. By turning, he did the only humane and natural thing, the thing any sailor would do. And the turn is part of what doomed her. Here is what actually happened to the shape of the ship in the water. The bow began to swing to the left. The stern, following the same long curve, began to swing the other way. And so the iceberg was no longer in front of the turning bow. It was now lined up with the long side of the ship, sweeping across toward it like the side of a door closing on something in the frame. Murdoch gave a second order, trying to swing the stern clear of the ice. Whether it helped or made things slightly worse has been argued ever since. What is certain is that it did not change what came next. The ship struck. To most of the people aboard, the strange thing was how small it felt. A shudder. A grinding tremble somewhere deep in the hull. Something rolling and scraping along the side from outside. A few described a sound like tearing cloth. Others thought a large wave had slapped the bow. The ship did not lurch. She did not stop short. Many passengers felt something and could not say what it was. Some of them simply went back to sleep. Far below in the engine and boiler rooms, the strike was felt very differently. Down there, it was loud and immediate. The order to stop the engines came down, and the great watertight doors began to drop. Men worked fast to get clear of them before they sealed. Some had to scramble through the narrowing gaps as the doors came down. For the crew in the depths of the ship, the emergency was real from the very first minute, long before the passengers above understood a thing. By the time the news reached the upper decks, those men had already been fighting the water for many minutes. The ship had 2 clocks running from the very first moment, a calm one above and a desperate one below, and only one of them was telling the truth. Above, almost no one knew yet. Up on the forward deck, ice had spilled from the berg as it scraped along the hull. A few of the passengers, who came out to look, picked the pieces up and turned them over in their hands, curious in the cold night air. Some of them laughed. Someone suggested putting a chip of it in a drink. They were holding fragments of the very thing that had just opened the ship beneath them. They did not yet understand what they held, and below the waterline, in the dark, the sea was already coming in. It gave nothing away. The damage was not what anyone would have pictured. Thomas Andrews had designed the Titanic. He was aboard as part of the shipyard team, and when the captain sent for him after the collision, he went below with a lamp to see for himself. He moved through the lower decks the way a person moves through a place they know by heart. He checked each compartment in turn, noting the water and measuring how fast it was rising. The iceberg had not punched a clean hole through the hull. People often picture a great gash torn in the side. That is not what happened. What the ice did was scrape along the side of the ship below the waterline, over a length of about 90 meters. Where it scraped, the steel buckled inward. Seams between the hull plates sprang open. Rivets failed under the sideways force, popping loose and leaving narrow gaps between the plates. That detail about the rivets matters more than it sounds. The hull plates were held together by millions of rivets. In the strong middle of the ship, those rivets were made of steel, driven by machine. But in the bow and the stern, where the great machines could not easily reach, the rivets were often the older kind. They were made of wrought iron and driven in by hand. Wrought iron is only as good as the work that makes it, and some of these rivets carried far more of a glassy waste called slag than they should have. That extra slag made them more brittle, especially in freezing water. The blow that the bow took fell on exactly the part of the ship held together by its weakest fasteners. The heads of those rivets snapped, and the plates they held simply let go. In places, the gaps left behind were surprisingly small. An engineer glancing at any single one of them might not have felt alarmed. The trouble was not the size of any one opening. It was where they ran. Together they reached through 5 of the forward compartments. 5. The ship had been built to survive. 4 flooded at once. Go back to the ice cube tray. With 4 cubes filling, the tray still floats. The bow would sit low, but she would hold. With 5, something different begins. The walls between the compartments only rose to a certain height, a level known as E-deck. As the weight of the flooding pulled the bow down, The water in the first compartment would climb until it reached the top of its wall. Then it would spill over into the next compartment. That one would fill. The bow would sink a little lower, and the water would reach the top of the following wall and spill again. Andrews worked the calculation through while standing on the lower decks, with cold water already rising around his feet. The walls were the right height for the accident the ship had been built to survive. They were the wrong height for this one. The whole difference between living and dying came down to that gap between 4 and 5. He climbed back to the bridge and told the captain what he had found. The ship was going to sink. He thought she had somewhere between 1 and 2 hours left. It was not a guess made in panic. Andrews knew this ship better than any person alive. He was not staring at a mystery. He was looking straight at the precise edge of a system he had helped design, watching it meet a situation that sat just past the boundary of what it could hold. There is one detail from those flooding decks that stays with people. The ship carried mail, and a team of postal clerks worked in a room low in the bow. When the water came in, they did not run. They began dragging heavy sacks of mail up toward higher decks, trying to save what they could. The sea rose faster than they could climb. None of them survived. It is a small picture of something that happened all over the ship that night. People doing their work to the very end. Below them, the water moved through the dark compartments without a sound. It was cold and patient and already at work, giving nothing away. Segment 11/21. Subtopic: the watertight promise. The watertight system had not failed. That is the strange and important thing about what Andrews found below. The doors had closed correctly when the switch was thrown on the bridge in the moments after the collision. The walls between the compartments were standing. The pumps in the engine rooms were running and slowing the rise of water in some sections. The system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. What it could not do was hold back water that had entered 5 compartments at once. The designers had built the walls to a height that made sense for the danger they were guarding against. A collision. A single hard blow from one direction. 1 or 2 compartments opened to the sea. That was the accident the ship had been built to survive. They had not carried the walls all the way to the top of the hull. To do so would have been impractical and hugely expensive, and it would have turned the inside of the ship into a row of sealed tubes that nobody could live in or move through. Think of a row of buckets joined in a line, but with the dividing walls stopping well short of the rim. Fill one bucket, pass that line, and the water simply pours over into the next. That is what the ship became once the 5th compartment was open. There is a painful what-if hidden in those walls. They reached only as high as they needed to for the planned accident. Had they been carried up just 1 or 2 decks higher, the spilling might have been contained. The ship might have stayed afloat for many more hours, long enough for rescue to arrive. The margin between survival and disaster was, quite literally, a question of a few feet of steel that were never built. Andrews understood all of this completely. He had helped make these very decisions. Standing in the rising water, he was not facing a riddle. He was facing the exact limit of a system he knew from the inside, watching it meet the one situation it had never been meant to hold. There is something worth sitting with here. Nothing on the ship was broken in the way we usually mean. The steel held, the doors held, the pumps ran. Every part did its job. And the ship was going to sink anyway, because the whole design had quietly assumed that the sea would only ever come at her in one particular way. The ocean had simply found a way that nobody had drawn on the plans. The captain took the information and acted on it at once. The order went out to uncover the lifeboats. The wireless operators were told to begin calling for help. The time was around 1:15 midnight. The 15th of April now. Less than 40 minutes had passed since the collision. On the decks above, most passengers still had no idea that anything serious had happened. The ship felt steady. The lights were burning. The engines had stopped. But that was not strange in itself. The night outside was cold and clear. The stars were out, and the Titanic was very large and very solid under their feet. The world did learn from those walls. After the disaster, the rules changed. New ships were required to carry their watertight walls higher, so that this exact kind of slow spilling could not happen again. The very flaw that doomed the Titanic became a line in the safety codes that protect ships today. It is cold comfort, but it is real. The lesson was paid for here, on this night, and it was not forgotten. It is a strange kind of legacy. The ship could not save herself, but the manner of her failure has saved countless others since. Every modern hull that stays afloat after damage carries a little of what was learned in this cold water. The walls are higher now because of where these walls stopped. That is not comfort enough for the people who were lost, but their loss became a warning the whole world finally listened to. It would not be unlearned. Deep below those feet, the water was crossing the first wall, giving nothing away. The ship was sinking for nearly an hour before most of the people aboard understood what that meant. This was not really a failure to pass on the news. The officers knew. Andrews knew. The wireless room had been told to call for help. But word moved through a ship of more than 2,000 people slowly and unevenly, and the ship herself was not yet giving any clear physical sign that matched the size of what was happening below. The deck was level, or close to it. The lights were on. The cold outside was the same cold it had been all evening. For most passengers, something had clearly gone wrong. But the situation still felt manageable, the kind of thing that would be explained and put right. Below the waterline, the water was spilling. It moved exactly the way Andrews had described, one compartment at a time, each step following the last without any hurry. The forward compartments flooded first and pulled the bow down. As the bow sank, the sea outside climbed higher along the front of the ship. Inside, the flooding ran toward the lowest point, which kept shifting forward and down. When it reached the top of the first wall, it crossed over. The next compartment began to fill. The bow pressed lower. The water reached the next wall and crossed that one too. There was a terrible patience to it. No rushing torrent, just a steady and quiet rise, wall after wall, each one giving way in turn. The sea was not breaking into the ship. It was filling her, the way water fills a tilted glass, slowly and completely, and without any sound a passenger could hear. Far down in the boiler rooms, men were still working in the rising water. The stokers and engineers stayed at their posts long after the danger was clear, keeping the pumps running and the great electric generators turning. It is worth pausing on that. The lights that stayed on across the whole ship. The lights that would let people find the boats in the dark. did not stay on by themselves. They burned because men chose to remain below and feed the machines in compartments that were slowly flooding around them. On deck, the slope was slowly becoming noticeable. A glass would slide a little on a table. Walking toward the bow felt different from walking toward the stern. Passengers who had come out to look at the stars began to notice that the front of the ship sat lower than it should, and went to find an officer to ask. The officers gave answers that were careful and true, just incomplete. The ship is damaged. Please put on your lifebelts. Please make your way up to the boat deck. There is a particular feeling buried in this hour. The ship was warm and bright and full of reassurance, and all of it was sincere, and all of it was wrong. The deepest danger of the night was not the cold or the ice. It was how calm everything still looked, while the sea climbed quietly from room to room below. Up in the public rooms, the strangeness of the hour showed in small ways. The grand staircase still gleamed under its lights. The warmth still held in the lounges. People stood about in lifebelts, pulled over evening clothes, unsure whether this was a true emergency or a careful precaution. The ship was asking them to believe two things at once: that everything was fine, and that they should put on a lifebelt and step out into the cold. Most people, for a while, chose to believe the first. It is easy, looking back, to wonder how anyone could doubt it. But doubt was reasonable in the moment. The ship felt like the safest place for miles, because for most of that hour it still was. The water was winning slowly, and slow danger is the hardest kind to believe, especially in a warm and brightly lit room. The room felt nothing of the sea. The water paid no attention to any of it. It kept moving, crossing each wall and filling each new space. It pressed the bow a little further down with every compartment it took, giving nothing away. There was a moment somewhere in that first hour when the captain and Andrew stood together, and both understood that the ship was going all the way down. Andrews had run the numbers and checked them. The answer came out the same each time. She would sink. The question was no longer whether, only when, and his estimate was less than 2 hours away. After that moment, everything changed shape. The captain ordered the lifeboats swung out. He told the wireless room to send without stopping. He sent officers below to wake the passengers and bring them up. And the hard truth of what he was asking showed itself almost at once. The ship carried 20 lifeboats. Together they could hold around 1,200 people. There were more than 2,200 people aboard. Even if every boat went down perfectly full, more than 1,000 people would still be left on the ship. The arithmetic was merciless, and it had been merciless from the moment she sailed. Under the original thinking, this had not been a problem. The ship was the survival platform. The boats were only there to carry people across to a rescuing vessel while she stayed afloat. For that, they were enough. For this, they were nowhere near enough. And then the loading made a bad situation worse. The boats began to go down, half empty. Some built for 65 went over the side carrying 30. One went with 12. The reasons were real and tangled, and none of them simple. Part of it was disbelief. The loading began in the cold and dark, with a crowd of people who mostly did not yet believe they were in danger. The ship was huge and solid under their feet. The boat was small, and the black water was a long way down, and the night was bitterly cold. Many people, offered a seat, said no. Given what they knew at that moment, it was a reasonable thing to feel. Part of it was a difference in orders. The instruction was women and children first. On one side of the ship, the officer in charge read that to mean women and children only, and lowered boats with empty seats, rather than let a man take one. On the other side, the officer let men board once the women and children nearby had gone. So your chance of living could depend on which side of the deck you happened to be standing on. And part of it was the shape of the ship itself. First and second class were high up, near the boats, and heard the news early. Many in third class were far below, behind long corridors, and some of those corridors were locked or unwatched. The distance from a third-class cabin to the boat deck was not just stairs, it was time, and time was the thing running out. Underneath all of it sat that same quiet belief. The deck was tilted, but it was still walkable. The lights were still on. The band had begun to play. An emergency, surely, did not have music. The numbers afterward told the story plainly. A passenger in first class had a far better chance of living than a passenger in third. A woman had a far better chance than a man. A child in the upper decks was very likely to live, while many children below were not. None of this was written down as a rule. It came out of the shape of the ship and the order of who heard. Some boats showed what was possible, loaded well and rowed away nearly full. Others pulled away half empty, while people still stood on the deck above. The difference was not the rule. It was the minute, and the officer, and the crowd that happened to be there when the boat went down. Behind every one of those numbers was a person, and a few seconds, and a door that was open or closed. The arithmetic was cruel, but it was not fate. It was the sum of 1,000 small moments, added up in the dark and paid out at dawn. By the time the truth was plain to everyone, the boats were already in the water. Most of the seats that had gone down empty were gone for good, given away to the dark. The distress call went out just after midnight. Phillips sent it again and again, on more than one frequency. He sent the CQD that was standard at the time, and the newer SOS that Bride suggested they try as well. There is a small piece of history in that. The SOS signal was so new, in 1912, that the Titanic was among the first great ships ever to send it in a real emergency. Bride even joked, in the middle of it, that this might be Philip's last chance to use the new code. Neither man could yet feel the full weight of the night. Phillips gave the ship's position with each call, but the position was slightly wrong, the result of a small error in the evening's navigation. That error would send the rescuers toward a spot some kilometers from where the Titanic actually lay. The calls went out into the night anyway, and they were heard. Think of those signals spreading outward in the dark, invisible. They raced across hundreds of kilometers of empty ocean, looking for anyone awake to catch them. Ships began to answer. The Frankfurt answered. The Mount Temple answered. The Olympic, the Titanic's own sister ship, answered from far to the east. And the Carpathia answered, a mid-sized liner running about 58 nautical miles to the southeast. Her captain was a man named Arthur Rostron. He took the distress call, confirmed it was real, and turned his ship at once. What he did next is one of the few bright threads in the whole night. He ordered every spare ounce of steam sent to the engines, and had the heating in his own ship shut down so that all the power could go to speed. He had his doctors prepare for the injured. He gathered blankets, hot drinks, and food. He swung out his own lifeboats, ready to help. He posted extra lookouts at the bow. And here is the courage in it. He was now driving hard into the same ice field, in the same darkness, that had just doomed the ship he was racing to save. He did everything a captain could do, and he did it fast. Even so, at her best speed, the Carpathia needed about 4 hours to reach the reported position. She was the closest ship that was actually coming. 4 hours for people already standing in air just above freezing. Somewhere much nearer, another ship sat silent. The Californian had stopped for the night in the ice, and her wireless operator was asleep. Her officers, watching from the bridge, saw rockets rising from a ship to the south. 8 white rockets sent up at intervals, which was the recognized signal for distress. The Californian did not move toward them. Her officers decided, through a conversation that has never been fully explained, that the rockets were probably company signals rather than calls for help. She held her position through the night, so the help that was coming was hours away, and the help that was close was not listening. On the Titanic, the rockets kept going up from the boat deck, one after another. They burst bright and white against the stars, throwing brief light across a sea so flat it might have been glass. On the Carpathia, the rescue was a whole ship's effort. Passengers were woken and asked to give up their cabins and their blankets. The cooks built great pots of hot soup and coffee. Stewards rigged slings and ropes to lift people who would be too cold and too weak to climb. A ship full of sleeping strangers turned itself, in a single hour, into a floating hospital racing through the dark. They did not yet know how many they would find, or how few. It is one of the few parts of this story that lifts the heart. A stranger turned his ship around in the night and drove it as hard as it would go, toward people he had never met. Whatever else the night showed about people, it showed that too. The calls went on into the dark. The Carpathia drove north as hard as her engines would allow, and the cold water around the ship lay still and patient, giving nothing away. The Californian had stopped for the night, and there is a hard kind of sadness in how reasonable that decision was. Her captain was a man named Stanley Lord. Early in the evening he had decided that pushing further through ice in the dark was a risk he would not take. He had brought his ship to a halt and told his crew they would wait for daylight. It was a careful choice, and a defensible one. The ice was real. The dark was genuine. Patience cost only a few hours. So the Californian sat. Her crew kept their watches. Her wireless operator switched off his set and went to bed. Through the night, several officers on her bridge watched a ship to the south. They could see her lights across the dark water. Over the course of about an hour, they saw her send up 8 rockets, white rockets bursting high above her, a few minutes apart. The officers talked about what they were seeing. The captain, resting nearby, was told about the rockets more than once. A slow and inconclusive conversation took place about what they might mean. The conclusion they reached was that the rockets were company signals. These were private signals between ships of the same line, which could look something like distress rockets without being the same thing. It was a reading the evidence allowed. Company signals did exist. White rockets could be company signals. It was a possible way to see the night. But the rules of the sea at the time, which the officers knew, were plain. Rockets fired at sea were to be treated as distress signals, unless there was clear proof otherwise. The proper response was to try to make contact, to move toward the vessel, to find out what was wrong. The doubt should have pushed them toward the ship, not away from it. The Californian had a signal lamp. She used it to flash at the ship to the south and got no clear answer back. She did not wake her wireless operator. She did not start her engines. She watched and she reasoned, and she stayed where she was. This is the part of the night that is hardest to sit with. There was no storm to fight. There was no wall of ice between the two ships. There was only a few kilometers of flat black water and a different reading of 8 white lights in the sky. A short voyage, an hour or two at most, lay between the Californian and the people in the water. The inquiries that followed were hard on Captain Lord. The argument about how far apart the two ships truly were, and whether the Californian could have arrived in time, has never fully ended. People still debate it. What is not in doubt is that a ship was firing rockets into the night, that another ship saw them, and that nobody woke the one man aboard who could have heard the calls for help. Out of all this came change. 2 great inquiries followed, one in America and one in Britain, and they pulled the whole night apart, hour by hour. From them came new laws, enough lifeboats for every soul aboard. A radio kept listening at all hours, and a patrol set up to watch the ice in the North Atlantic and warn ships away, a patrol that still sails today. The price of those rules was paid in a single night, and the sea has been a little safer ever since. That is perhaps the strangest comfort the Titanic offers. The rules that now protect every traveler at sea were written in the cold water of that night. Each lifeboat seat, each listening radio, each warning of ice. In a sense, they are the ship's true legacy, paid for at the highest possible price. It is a debt the sea collected in full. The rockets went up, and then they stopped. The lights of the ship to the south, which had seemed to sink lower with each look, slipped away and were gone. The Californian's operator was woken at 5 in the morning by the arriving dayman. Within minutes he understood. The ship started her engines and moved south. The water where the lights had been was cold and flat and empty, giving nothing away. Down by 2 in the morning, the bow was under water. The sea had climbed the forward deck, reached the base of the forecastle, and begun crossing surfaces that had been dry 3 hours before. The portholes along the front of the ship went under one by one. For a moment the light inside each one glowed up through the water, a pale circle beneath the surface, and then the compartment behind it flooded and the light went out. The ship was being switched off, window by window, from the bow back. At the stern, the deck was rising. The slope had passed the point where anyone could ignore it. 15 degrees, then steeper. You had to hold on to something to stand. Loose objects were beginning to slide and roll down the long decks toward the water. The funnels, enormous steel towers held up by wire stays, were groaning under loads they had never been built to carry. The hull itself was being asked to do something it was never designed for. Picture a long beam held at both ends. The flooded bow pulled one end down. The air still trapped in the stern held the other end up. All of that strain gathered in the middle of the ship, in the steel between the two great forces, and the steel was beginning to feel it. The last boats were a different scene from the first. Earlier, the loading had been calm, almost too calm. Now the deck was steeply tilted, and the water was visibly climbing, and the calm was gone. The final boats left crowded, and there were not enough of them left for the people still aboard. 2 collapsible boats were still lashed down when the water reached them, and the crew were fighting to free them as the sea arrived. One floated off, half ready. One floated off, upside down. Men would cling to its overturned hull through the rest of the night. More than 1,500 people were still on the ship. The boats were gone. Some passengers had climbed toward the high ground at the stern and were holding on. Some were praying. Some were simply trying to find any footing above the rising water. The band was still playing on the boat deck. Accounts of what they played in those last minutes differ. Accounts that they kept playing do not. All 8 of them died. The cold by now was in everything. The air and the water were almost the same temperature, both just above freezing. Anyone who had been outside for more than an hour was deeply chilled, in a way that slows thought and movement. In the lifeboats, a few hundred meters off in the dark, the people who had gotten away early enough could hear the sounds carrying across the still water. They could see the lights of the ship still burning, throwing yellow light along a hull that now tilted steeply into the sky. The men below were keeping those lights alive even now. In these last minutes, there were countless small acts that survived in memory. An elderly couple who had built a life together chose to stay side by side rather than be parted. The ship's designer was seen alone in a first-class room, staring at nothing, a man watching his life's work come apart. Officers worked the falls with steady hands, while the deck tilted under them. People gave up their places. People held one another. The ship was going down, and the people on her were still somehow deciding who to be. That is the part that stays with people. They chose in their last hour who to be. Many were brave or kind or calm, when no one would have blamed them for being otherwise. It is the quiet dignity of that hour that endures. Then the forward funnel came down. It tore loose and hit the water with a sound that reached every boat and every person still aboard, and a wave spread out from where it fell. The bow was going under. The stern was lifting higher, and the sounds coming from inside the hull were beginning to change. Deep groans of metal under strain, the ship herself starting to give, while the flat sea around her gave nothing away. The ship breaks apart. The Titanic broke in 2. This was not known for certain until the wreck was found in 1985. Survivors had described sounds like cannon fire, like tearing, like something deep in the ship giving way. They had seen her behave strangely in her last minutes, but the accounts were so varied, and the night so dark, and the shock so immediate, that the exact sequence stayed in dispute for decades. For a long time, the official story held that she had gone down whole and unbroken. The wreck settled the question. The ship had broken somewhere near the 3rd and 4th funnels, roughly in the middle, but a little toward the stern. To understand why, think again of that long beam under strain. The forward half, flooded and heavy, had been pulling downward for some time. The stern half, still holding pockets of air, had been holding up. The keel along the bottom of the ship had been trying to keep those 2 great forces joined. At some point, it simply could not, and the ship tore apart under her own weight. When the break came, the forward section went under almost at once, freed now of the buoyancy that had been partly holding it. The stern, suddenly released from the weight that had been dragging it down by the bow, settled back and rose toward level for a moment. To the people in the boats it must have looked, for one breath, as though the worst was over. Then the flooding that had been creeping through its own compartments took hold. The stern began to go down as well, slowly tipping until it stood high against the sky, and then sliding under. There is a myth worth clearing away here. People long imagined that a great sinking ship drags everything nearby down with it, in a huge and violent pull. In truth, the survivors closest to the ship reported surprisingly little of that. The danger in the water was not being sucked under. The danger was the cold. In the water around the wreck there were hundreds of people, most of them wearing life jackets that held them up. The sea was just below freezing. Survival in water that cold is measured in minutes, not hours. The cold works in order. It takes the breath first, in a single gasp, then the strength of the hands and arms, then the warmth of the core, and finally, the mind. Voices called out across the dark surface. The lifeboats were not far away. Most of the boats did not go back. The reasons given afterward were human ones. Fear of being swamped and pulled under by a crowd of people in the water. Not knowing in the dark where the voices even were. The sheer difficulty of rowing a heavy boat in the right direction with frightened and exhausted people aboard. One boat, Lifeboat 14, did return. Its officer moved his passengers into other boats, waited until the worst of the sound had faded, then rowed back into the wreckage and pulled a handful of people from the surface. Here is the hard truth about the water that night. Almost everyone in it was wearing a lifebelt, so almost no one drowned in the usual sense. They floated, and because they floated, in water just below freezing, the cold had all the time it needed. What took the people in the water was not the sea closing over them. It was the sea holding them up, in a temperature the body cannot survive, while help was still hours away. There is something almost gentle in understanding it that way, and something terrible. Gentle because it was quick and quiet and mostly painless at the end. Terrible because help was so close and the water asked for so little time. A warmer sea would have given them hours. This one gave them minutes, and the minutes were almost gone. That hesitation is one of the quietest tragedies of the night. The boats had room, the water had people, and the distance between them was only fear, and dark, and cold. The water grew colder, the voices grew fewer, and the surface slowly went quiet, giving nothing away. After the stern went down, the North Atlantic settled. There were sounds for a while, the voices in the water thinning as the cold did its work. Survivors who lived to tell of it spoke of a great collective sound from the people in the sea, and then of how slowly it faded, and of how the fading was worse than the sound itself, the shift and creak of people moving in the boats, the knock of floating debris against wood. But these diminished, and within 20 minutes or so of the stern disappearing, the area was quieter than it had been for hours. Within 40 minutes, it was nearly silent. The lifeboat sat in the dark. A few had lamps. One officer kept a small green flare burning at intervals, partly to keep his scattered boats together, partly so that any rescuer would have something to steer toward. The people in the boats were cold, many of them badly cold, and almost all of them had lost someone. They sat and they waited, and the water around them was black and flat. The stars overhead were the same stars that had been there above the ship all evening, unchanged by anything that had happened beneath them. The debris field was wide, deck chairs and life rings, bottles and luggage, broken furniture and cork from the life jackets, all of it spread across several square kilometers of ocean. The Titanic herself was not among it. She was already somewhere below, falling slowly through the dark toward a seafloor no one had ever seen. The cold was everywhere. The officer in charge of one boat moved through it again and again over the remaining hours, waking people who had drifted towards sleep, because sleep in that cold was not safe. Some of the people he tried to wake had already stopped answering. What struck the survivors most, when they tried later to describe it, was the silence. The ship had been a city, lit and warm and full of sound, full of engines and music and voices, and then it was gone, and the ocean that had taken it showed no sign at all of what had happened. The surface was flat, the stars were out. The cold lay over everything, present and complete, and indifferent. This is the heart of why the night stays with people. It is not only the loss, enormous as it was. It is how little the sea seemed to register it. A ship of 2,000 lives slipped beneath the surface, and the water closed over the place, and lay still again, as though nothing had ever crossed it. The same flat black mirror, the same reflected stars. No mark, no scar, no sign. For the people in the boats, the rest of the night was a long wait in the cold for a light on the horizon. They did not know if any ship had heard them. They did not know if help was coming. They only knew that it was very cold and very dark and very quiet. Slowly over those hours, the sky in the east began to change. A faint grey came into it, then the first cold colour of dawn. With the light came shapes on the water, the scattered boats, the drifting wreckage, and the ice was all around them, great pale shapes, and a long white field of it. It was the very danger that had done all this, now plainly visible in the morning. The people in the boats had stared at that horizon for hours, hoping for a light. When the Carpathia finally appeared, low and far off, some could not quite believe it. They had waited so long in the cold and the dark that rescue itself felt unreal. And then it was real. The shape on the water was a ship, and it was coming for them. The longest night any of them had ever known was finally ending. Warmth was still hours away for most, but hope had arrived with the dawn, in the form of a single ship driving out of the ice. It had come a long way in the dark, somewhere to the south, driving hard through the ice in the dark. The Carpathia was still coming. The boats waited for her, hour after freezing hour, in a silence so deep it felt like the sea was giving nothing away. The Titanic fell in 2 pieces, and she fell for a long time. The bow section went first. It entered the water at an angle and kept going down, moving quickly at first, and then slowing as the pressure of the deep built against it. The Atlantic here is nearly 4,000 meters deep. The descent took something like 15 minutes. 15 minutes of falling straight down through water that grew darker and colder and heavier with every meter. Think of what those minutes were like. Near the surface there was still the faint memory of light. A little way down, that was gone, and the bow was falling through complete blackness. The cold deepened. The pressure built on every surface, squeezing inward from all sides. And still she fell, down past depths where sunlight has never once reached, toward a floor of soft grey mud in the dark. The bow had a kind of grace in its fall. Heavy and streamlined, it planed forward as it sank. It almost glided, the way a waterlogged plank knives down through a pond. It met the seafloor still moving fast and drove deep into that mud, crushing the forward sections and burying the hull up to its anchor chains. Further back, where the steel was less damaged, the structure settled more gently. The railing along the front of the bow stayed whole, the way it can still be seen today. The stern fell differently, and its fall was violent. It had been full of trapped air when it went under. As it sank, the pressure climbed fast and forced that air out through every gap and opening, with enough force to tear the structure apart and collapse the upper decks inward. It tumbled rather than glided. By the time it reached the bottom, the stern was badly deformed, its shape as a ship largely gone. It came to rest about 600 meters from the bow, facing the other way. Between the two halves lay the debris field, thousands of objects that had broken free during the sinking or the long fall. Shoes and boots, their soles outlasting the leather above them. Dishes, bottles, a safe, pieces of furniture. The small belongings of people who were already gone, scattered across the dark floor like the contents of a life turned out into the deep. The seafloor at that depth is soft and cold and utterly dark. The pressure there is around 400 times the pressure at the surface. It is the kind of weight that would crush an ordinary submarine like a tin can. Almost nothing moves. The Titanic settled into the sediment, and the sediment slowly rose around her, and the cold pressed in from every side. And from the moment she landed, she quietly began the long process of returning to the ocean. The place she came to rest is its own kind of world. The deep seafloor is a vast plain of soft pale mud, stretching for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, flatter and emptier than any desert. There is no light. There are no seasons. The temperature barely shifts from one age to the next. It is hard to picture the loneliness of it. If you stood there, you would see nothing in any direction. There would be only the slow drift of pale flecks falling through the water, the endless dust of the living world far above. Into that silent plain came the two halves of the ship, settling a third of a mile apart, raising slow clouds of mud that took hours to settle again. She has been lying in that stillness ever since. No storm reaches it, no season touches it. The clouds of mud she raised on landing settled long ago. Nothing has truly disturbed her since, except the slow and patient work of the deep itself, which never rests. It works in her still, slowly and without end. 2,224 people had sailed on her. 1,514 of them died, and all of them came to rest in the cold and the dark. They lay in a place that would keep them hidden and would keep giving nothing away for another 70 years. The wreck was not found for 73 years. Expedition after expedition had tried and failed. The ocean is enormous. The position sent out that night was slightly wrong, and the seafloor at that depth cannot be searched the way you might search a field. You cannot see down there from the surface. You cannot dive there in any ordinary way. For 7 decades, the most famous ship in the world simply sat in the dark, more than 3,000 meters down, while the world above could only guess at where she lay. What finally found her is one of the least known parts of the whole story. The man who led the search was named Robert Ballard. He had wanted to find the Titanic for years, and he could not get the money to do it. What he could get was a deal with the United States Navy. The Navy would pay for the ships and the technology, but only if he first carried out a secret task for them. His real assignment was to find and survey the wrecks of 2 American nuclear submarines that had been lost in the Atlantic in the 1960s. The Navy wanted to know what had happened to them and to make sure their secrets stayed out of other hands. The search for the Titanic, the thing the public would later celebrate, was in large part a cover story. It gave a public reason for Ballard to be out there with deep-sea equipment, while the real and classified work was done first. Only when the submarines had been surveyed was he given what was left, a narrow window of about 12 days to look for the ship he had actually come for. 12 days, after years of waiting, to search a patch of deep ocean for a wreck nobody had been able to find. But the submarines had taught him something. When he surveyed those lost subs, he saw how their wreckage lay on the bottom. It did not sit in one neat pile. As a ship breaks up and sinks, it scatters a long trail of debris across the seafloor, carried sideways by the currents as it falls. He realized that the trail was far larger and easier to find than the ship itself. So instead of hunting for the hull, his team towed a camera sled called Argo slowly along the bottom. They watched, not for the ship but for her trail. Argo was a sled of cameras on a long cable, sending live pictures up to the ship through the night. The team watched those screens in shifts, hour after hour, while the sled drifted over empty grey mud. For most of the search, there was nothing to see, just the seafloor, scrolling past in the dark, mile after mile of nothing. Then, in the small hours of the 1st of September, something appeared that did not belong. The year was 1985. A round shape on the seafloor, a boiler. The boilers of the Titanic had been photographed and described in such detail over the decades that the team knew it almost at once. Ballard came back the next year to see her properly. This time he brought a small submarine that could carry people down, and a little robot on a tether that could swim in through the openings. For the first time, human eyes looked through the windows of the Titanic in the dark. He made one choice that mattered. He took nothing. He believed the wreck was a grave, and that it should be left as it was, and he carried no piece of her back to the surface. Later expeditions would feel differently, and that argument continues to this day. It is a fitting image to end the search on. A lost ship, found at last, and then deliberately left in peace. The dark that had hidden her for 73 years was allowed in the end to keep her. A hush fell over the room. One of the French members of the team said quietly that there were many people who had died here. Ballard, who had searched for this ship for so long, slipped away to be alone for a while. They had found her. The ship that had given nothing away for 73 years was suddenly there on the screens, lit for a moment in the dark, before the dark closed over her again. In the years since she was found, people have gone back to the wreck again and again. Cameras have drifted along her decks. Small robots have slipped inside her. And every visit shows the same thing. She is never quite the same as she was the last time anyone looked. The bow, after all these years, is still recognizable. It sits upright in the silt, the railing intact, the anchor chains running down into the mud. You can make out the shapes of the officers' rooms. 600 meters away, the stern lies collapsed and deformed, barely readable as the same ship. and between them lies the debris field, spread across the seafloor the way it once spread across the surface. The dishes, the bottles, the safe, and the shoes still resting in pairs, where a person once came quietly to rest. That last detail holds one of the strangest facts about the deep. There are no bodies on the wreck. Not one has ever been found. The reason is chemistry, not mystery. Below a certain depth, the cold sea is hungry for the very substance that bones are made of, and it slowly dissolves them into the water. So once the deep has done its work, even the bones go. Only the shoes are left behind. The leather was treated in a way the small creatures of the deep tend to avoid. So the shoes remain, paired on the mud, marking the places the people came down. Every surface of the ship is covered in soft reddish growths that hang like icicles from the steel. They have a name. They are called rusticles, and they are alive. They are built by bacteria that feed on iron, and a species found on the Titanic was new to science, named after the ship herself. They have been feeding on her for more than 100 years. They are patient, and they are relentless. The ship is being taken apart at the smallest scale, atom by atom, and carried off into the water. This is the strangest turn in the whole story. The Titanic is not simply resting down there, frozen and preserved. She is being eaten slowly and steadily by living things. Estimates differ, but many scientists believe much of the hull will collapse and be gone within the lifetime of people alive today. The wreck we can still see is not permanent. It is a slow disappearance, already well underway. The deep did not just hide her, it is digesting her. So this is the floor of the descent, the place where the story comes to rest. The thing everyone knows is the night she sank. The things almost no one knows are what came after. A ship lost for 73 years, found by accident on a secret mission. A wreck with no bodies, only paired shoes in the dark. A great hull being eaten alive and quietly returned to the sea. It is strange to think how much of our world was shaped by this one wreck. The lifeboats that every ship now carries for every passenger. The radios that never stop listening. The patrol that still watches the ice each spring. We changed the way we cross the sea because of what happened here. And the ship that taught us all of it lies in the dark, being slowly unmade, keeping her own quiet counsel at the bottom of the world. The story does not really end. It only goes quiet, the way the sea did, on a still night long ago. The Titanic sits there still. The same cold that pressed against the people in those lifeboats presses against her hull now. The same dark that was above them when she went down surrounds her completely. The pressure at that depth does not change with the seasons or the years. It is simply there, the weight of nearly 4 kilometers of water resting on a ship that has now been on the seafloor far longer than almost anyone alive has been alive. And far above, the North Atlantic goes on. The ice still drifts south each spring on the cold current. The water that was ice becomes ocean again, cold and dark and indifferent, the same water it has always been. It closed over her on a still night long ago, and it has been giving nothing away ever since.